Hello again, friends. We are on our Story Mountain anchor chart, and we are going to take our anchor chart that looks like this, and we're going to make it look finished, something like this with some extra notes on it while Miss Hughes talks to you about our Story Mountain. You need to make sure that you have 5 different colors. They can be highlighters, they can be markers, they can be colored pencils, and something to write with. I am using a pen. So let's get started. Story Mountain is the title. A story mountain helps the reader understand a story tends to go. It's the plot is the basic sequence of events in a story. So we're going to come through here and we're going to underline Story Mountain. And we're going to remember that Story Mountain has to do with the plot that we talked about in our last video, which is the basic sequence of events in a story. Now we're going to remember that sequence is just a fancy word. So I'm going to box it out over here and I'm going to come to the side and we're just going to remind ourselves that sequence means order. Okay. So, the very first thing that happens in our Story Mountain is our exposition. Now, our exposition is the background characters, their information, the introduction, character setting, and main conflicts are introduced. That's called the exposition. This is usually the beginning of the book, where they're introducing characters, what might be happening in the book when we pick it up, or where and when the book or story takes place. Now we're going to follow our Story Mountain and we're going to go up to our rising action. Our rising action are the events and action that move the story along and the problem begins to build. So our rising action, it's the events and action that move the story along and the problem begins to build. So maybe we're seeing the introduction of a possible problem, but not quite the problem itself. Next is our climax. Notice that it's at the very top of our Story Mountain. Our climax is the turning point of the story. The action of the story builds and the main conflict must be faced. So I'm going to highlight that and I'm going to even underline it to help us understand that it's really important. The main conflict must be faced here in the climax. So if we're thinking about our third grade books that we read last year, you possibly read The Princess and Goblin with Miss Rocha and I last year. And when we got to the climax of the book, we knew that our mountain boy was inside the area where the trolls were and he was caught and we had no idea how he was going to come out. So that would be the climax. Now notice that we're coming down the mountain. As we come down our Story Mountain, we're going to notice that there's a falling action, just like there is a rising action. Our falling action are any loose ends that are tied and the conflict begins to be resolved. Now, as we follow all the way down to the end of our Story Mountain, we get to something that's called the resolution. Your resolution is where your story comes to an end. The problem is resolved. So I'm going to take my underliner and I'm going to box out end. And I'm also going to say the problem is resolved. All right, friends, we did an awesome job on our Story Mountain today. We learned about the exposition, that is the background information and introduction. We talked about our rising action, where the events and action move the story along and problems begin to build. We talked about the climax being the turning point of the story and where the conflict must be faced. And then we also talked about the falling action, where any loose ends are tied. And finally, we come to the resolution where the problem is solved. Make sure that your anchor chart of Story Mountain looks like my anchor chart of Story Mountain. And make sure we're following the directions on our Google assignment to know what happens next.